This is it. This is it. This is the book we needed. This is the book that we need to start 2021 off with. If you haven't watched my last video review, I talked about a Korean novel called My Brilliant Life, which seemed to bridge the gap a little bit between all of the trauma porn of 2020 and what I hoped would be a little bit more of a positive year in literature for 2021. And that positivity starts with Luster. Luster is a novel by Raven Leilani. It is her debut novel, and it tells the story of a young black New Yorker just living a very young millennial kind of a life. Our protagonist, Edie, is working a very low-level, kind of rubbish office job in a small publishing house. I think it's a children's book publisher. And the book opens hysterically with her having internet sex with a guy that she is seeing tentatively. I'm not sure they've actually even had a date yet. And this guy is a middle-aged white suburban guy who lives in a house in New Jersey. And the two of them are talking and eventually they go on a date. The date happens pretty early on. And the deal with this guy, Eric, is that he's in a kind of open marriage. He and his wife have sort of agreed on an open marriage, but throughout the book you never see any evidence of her taking advantage of that. Only him. Enter Edie. So the whole book is from Edie's perspective. It's in the first person. It's quite a short book. It's about 220 pages. And it is exactly as long as it needs to be in order to accomplish a pretty well-rounded narrative about Edie's life and the journey that she goes on with Eric and his family. Now, because Eric is in an open marriage and his wife isn't in the same open marriage, if you like, there's immediately this sense that Edie exists as an unwanted outside presence. Let me go back a bit. The book is effectively split into two halves. The first half is a very intimate exploration of Edie's life. We get snippets of her past, of her parents' lives, and it's all told in a first-person perspective. The whole book is written in the present tense, which gives it a sense of immediacy and presence, and then any little snippets that are in the past are obviously written in the past tense. And Edie's life is moving at a pretty good click, but that doesn't mean that it is in any way a satisfying life for her. Edie is sleeping around the office. At the beginning, she's sleeping with a predominantly white office, and all of these men are happy to take advantage, are happy to enjoy the ride. And now she's met Eric, and Eric takes her on a date. They go to this theme park. I can't remember where it is, but they go to this kind of children's theme park, and she realizes quickly that they've gone there because there's no chance of him running into anyone that he knows. So there's an aspect of shame. Fortunately for us, Eric actually doesn't play a huge role in the story. As the first half goes on, a lot of pretty awful things happen to Edie that result in her, for the second half of the book, living with Eric in his white picket fence suburban home. I'm not telling you anything that the blurb doesn't really tell you, don't worry. And something that the blurb also mentions is that Eric and his wife, Rebecca, have a black adopted daughter around the age of 12, 13. This daughter's name is Akila, and she is a fantastic character. In many ways, she is my favorite character in the book. She is a young nerd. She plays Mario Kart and JRPGs, and she watches subtitled anime and K-dramas. She's a lovely child. She is worldly in a sense because she's gone through a few foster homes now. This is her third home. She's been there for 2 years. Now that Edie is kind of a part of their family in a weird way, obviously they never use the word mistress. She's the girlfriend, but this open marriage is not really on even footing, and Edie has ended up living with them more at the behest of Rebecca than of Eric. And that's what's so interesting about this book, is that Edie is forming relationships with Eric and Rebecca and Akila, but in very, very different ways. She and Eric are fucking. They are screwing around. They are having fun, I guess. But she's building more of a mature relationship with Rebecca that's a lot more complex. And as I was reading the book, I couldn't help but wonder what Luster would look like if it was told from Rebecca's perspective rather than Edie's. And then of course I thought, well, if this book was from Rebecca's perspective, I would much rather see it from Edie's perspective. So I guess it's a kind of have your cake and eat it situation. Because Rebecca is a fascinating character. It plays on the imagery that you see in the film American Beauty, that Kevin Spacey twist on the dark underbelly of Americana and suburbia, because Rebecca loves being out pruning the flowers and being the suburban wife and fulfilling that kind of stereotype and fantasy, or whatever you want to call it. And yet Rebecca actually has a lot of layers that get pulled back thanks to her relationship with Edie, and obviously a very strange relationship that she has with her husband Eric. It's a weird situation, and despite the fact that they are the entire supporting cast, we actually don't get that much of an insight into the situation that Eric and Rebecca find themselves in, how they came to adopt Aquila, how they ended up in this open relationship thing. The only telltale sign of all of this is the fact that they are unhappy together. And so they've tried things out. They adopted a child. They agreed on an open marriage. They're trying to do things to keep themselves alive, to keep this suburban fantasy going. And that's really interesting. And especially when you consider the fact that Rebecca's job, she works in a morgue. And so you've kind of got this imagery, this symbolism of her, you know, bringing up the dead all the time, being around the dead, keeping dead things alive in some kind of fake capacity. Almost seems like it's an allegory for their relationship. It's kind of a dead thing that they're desperately trying to make look beautiful in some way, which is kind of what people do with cadavers. So that's a really interesting way of delivering this. The story itself is pretty simple to follow. What the book really succeeds at doing, though, is building the characters of Edie and Aquila, and more importantly, the way that they're described. I think that Raven Leilani has an incredible grasp of language and the power that language can have over mood and tone and the feelings and the emotions of the reader as they go on. That's probably the book's greatest strength. As an example, I'm going to show you how at the very beginning of the book, you can see how everything is broken into very small subchapters. The book is 8 chapters long. These chapters are, say, 20, 30, 40 pages each. In between them are very small subchapters all the time. Every page or so has these constant breaks. So it's almost every paragraph or so you get a little subchapter, a little break, and it kind of feels like diary entries. But very, very cleverly and very, very quickly, at the end of chapter 2, Raven Leilani takes this idea and starts to break it down. So suddenly you don't have any more of these chapter breaks. So now you've got full chapters with short paragraphs. And then those short paragraphs become much longer paragraphs. And here, right at the end of chapter 2, is a full double-page spread of one single paragraph, and there are barely any sentences. So the book is actually building up pace like a runaway train, especially in chapter 2. This is when you first really see it, and it's when it's best executed. You've gone from these kind of plodding steps. That's what these subchapters feel like, plodding steps. And then it starts to run. And then it gets away from itself and it can't control its momentum anymore, and it's spiraling out of control like a runaway train. And then right at the end of chapter 2, you really feel it. She has ended up in Eric and Rebecca's house, and she hasn't met Rebecca yet. She's heard a bit about Rebecca, and she's in Eric's house. Eric is not there. When you read this paragraph, the final paragraph of chapter 2, you cannot help but speed up as you read. So I'll show you what I mean. It's brilliant use of grammar and linguistic structure, fantastic command of tone and tense and presence. It's gorgeous, right? Now I know where he lives, so 10 days after having fucked him in the bed he shares with his wife, I go right up to the door and I find it unlocked, and no one is home. So I walk around the house and I pick up these cold lemons on the counter and roll them around in my hands. And I open up the fridge and I take a drink of milk and carry the carton up to the bedroom, where a door opens to a closet with a collection of women's clothes, and I gather the silk and the wool and the cashmere in my hands, and then there's a voice, and I turn, and standing in the doorway of the attached bathroom in yellow rubber gloves and a t-shirt that says Yale is his wife. It's fantastic. This paragraph is a single sentence, and this sentence barrels on as it goes. And I love the way that it's her wandering in the house, picking up these cold lemons and feeling them. You get the smell and the texture of it. And then she goes upstairs, and that texture continues as she feels through the clothes, and then suddenly it's building and it's building, and you cannot stop. It's incredible. The use of descriptive language, the use of physical space, the use of items and smells and senses, it creates this atmosphere that you cannot escape from. You're suddenly in a cloud of smells and colours and light, and within that cloud suddenly appears this woman out of nowhere, and that's where the chapter ends, and it cuts. And it is exhausting. You finish the chapter having gone through all of this, and you're exhausted and you feel out of breath as you read it, and you need to take a break. And that's just through the power of the choreography, it's kind of what it feels like, is that Raven Leilani has choreographed this moment. She's taken this book as though it was a film. She's the director, she's the cinematographer, she's the costume designer and the set designer. And that is the job of an author, that an author must be able to do all of these things in order to project their ideas into the mind of the reader. But she really succeeds in a way that feels far more visceral than I've encountered. You know, we kind of take for granted that this is an author's job, but this made me consider it. This made me think about it in a way that I often don't have to. So I put it down and suddenly this is just going through my mind all the time. Now, another thing that really works with this book is the tone. This is a book that at times has elements of tragedy. At the end of the first half of the book, some really bad things have happened to Edie, and her past is checkered with some pretty miserable things. And the very ending, which I'm not going to spoil, the last 20 pages or so, is catastrophically, aggressively frustrating. There are moments in this ending that make you want to ball up your fists and punch something. It's not fair. It reminds you of how awfully unfair the real world is, especially in the United States, especially for black people in the United States, especially for young black women in the United States. It's exhausting. And I will say that there are only moments in this book where it is aggressively political. Now, I love aggressively political things, but this book is kind of beautifully attuned to the idea that while politics is so important and we can't escape it, we live in a world where all of our thoughts and actions and feelings are in some way connected to our politics. Edie is also a human being living her life. She's a New Yorker. She is a young woman trying to live and work and find meaning and satisfaction. She's a painter. She's a failed painter who is always tempted to pick up the brush again. So she's living a life. She's a human being living a life, but of course she's a political entity because we all are. And the book manages to kind of juggle those two things very, very well, predominantly focusing on her just trying to live a life. It's a very millennial book. It covers rent and bills. It talks about the fact that we need 2 jobs, the fact that none of us can be homeowners. It makes jokes about millennials, and it does not feel tired in any way. And it reinforces this with some really fun pop culture references, especially with Akilah, the daughter. She's a nerd. She wants to go to Comic-Con. She likes cosplay. She likes anime and video games. She's a little weeb, and I'm a little weeb, and so I kind of love that about her. And of course, what immediately makes them bond, her and Edie, is the fact that they're both black. And they're both black in a predominantly white household in a white neighborhood in suburbia in New Jersey. And Akilah doesn't know how to do her hair. And so Edie shows her. Edie becomes a surrogate role model, big sister, mother figure for her. While at the same time, they are both young and they are both nerds and they both enjoy playing Mario Kart together. And so it's absolutely beautiful, and it has enough dimension to keep it really, really interesting, regardless of whether what's making them bond is something that's a little bit sorrowful or a little bit joyful. It works either way. It works constantly, and it keeps the tone and the emotion of the book feeling like it's fluctuating in an enlivening kind of a way. And that tone also carries itself through Edie's life. You know, the men that she sleeps with, the jobs that she has, the choices that she makes, some of them are a little sad, a little pathetic, a little bit desperate perhaps. What she's doing though is she's always infusing this with a sense of freedom. You know, she is a person with agency who does whatever she wants. She doesn't always consider the consequences because she's 23, and when I was 23 I was an idiot. You know, she smokes a joint outside on her lunch break, and she's trying to get away with having sex with a guy through the internet while she's on office hours, things like this. She's careless and carefree, and she's frustrated. This is emblematic of being in a frustrating job that isn't satisfying her in any way. You know, it's the sense of looking for satisfaction elsewhere, etc., etc. We've all done this. I've been guilty of similar things. I think a lot of us have. And so that makes her feel very real, very relevant. You know, Zadie Smith on the front of the book, it says, it's a taut-sharp, funny book about being young now. It's brutal and brilliant, and that really does sum it up. It is about being young now. It is about living as a young person in a big city in the West right now. And it feels that kind of sense of presence, and that's why it's darkly funny. You know, I read a viral tweet recently that said, "Did you have a happy childhood or are you funny?" And yeah, like, humor is what keeps us going. It's what keeps us alive when things feel kind of dismal and hopeless. And so it is a book that makes jokes about global warming. It is a book that makes jokes about capitalism. And that humor is really, really alive in this book. It is absolutely beautiful. There is a wonderful moment, probably the funniest part of the book, is when she's reminiscing about her childhood, talking about the Sabbath, talking about going to church and the priest, etc. And she says that her mum drew pictures of Satan that confused her as a child until she had the language to explain that she was aroused. And I thought that that was absolutely brilliant. It reminded me of that story of that Italian, what they call people who carve things. Carver, mason, not mason, can't remember the word. People who make statues. And he makes a statue of Lucifer, but it was too hot and sexy, and so then they got his brother to carve one, but it was even sexier. That's what it immediately reminded me of. Anyway, I don't even know if that was true. It was just a meme. But that's another thing, is that this book is kind of full of Twitter and memes, but it doesn't feel like it's trying to appease us or make it relevant to young people today. It's not doing that. Yeah, it's not placating our sense of humor. And it's, because of that, is originally witty. It's a book that's full of kindness and strangeness. The situation that Edie finds herself in is fucking weird, and she rolls with it in the best way that she can. And this book is peppered with tragedy. Terrible, terrible things happen. Things that make you angry, things that make you sad, things that make you want to give her a hug. She's a wonderfully lovable and interesting person, but she also feels a very ordinary person. She's an ordinary young black woman in New York, but she's found herself in this weird situation where she cannot see herself reflected in the people that she meets until she meets Aquila, and Aquila sees something of herself in Edie, and so they create this equilibrium that kind of sits at the center of the book, and the white people spin around outside of it. It's a book that's full of dynamism. It's full of beauty, it's full of fun, and I think its strongest element is how well written it is. The control, as I've said, that Raven Leilani has over language is remarkable. Not just over language, but over pacing, over punctuation, over tone. It's also a book that doesn't have a lot of dialogue. The speech within the book is pretty bare bones. A lot of it is her telling us what people are saying. It feels in some ways like a diary. He said this, she said this. And it's all in the first person in the present tense, so it feels very immediate. It feels sometimes like a diary, sometimes a bit like a stream of consciousness, and Edie has control over that. She has control over the tone of her story as she's telling it. And I think that's really lovely and very empowering. And especially for a woman who feels like she has no power, has no control of her life right now, the idea that she's at least taking control of her narrative and her story is very uplifting and comforting in many ways. This is a fantastic book. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. You're probably going to see a lot of hype around it. You probably already have, and it is entirely deserved. This is a very, very exciting book for 2021. It's a breath of fresh air. It genuinely feels like opening the door and going outside and breathing clean air. It's lovely. It's a palate cleanser in some ways, and I want more books that are exactly like this one. All right, read Luster and subscribe for books.